community, and just so cool to see the response of churches and NGOs and private individuals who are just packing their cars full of food and driving into the what we call the townships, which are the slum areas that surround our cities, where millions upon millions of people live in little shacks with very little, access to any of the luxuries that a lot of us have. It's like 100 people share a toilet, sort of thing, and a tap, and live in these shanty towns. So it's quite devastating, the impact of the economic lockdown, and it's that crazy tension between forcing people even deeper into poverty in a very fragile, broken economy, and obviously fighting this virus as well. And our president has chosen health over economy, and so we're seeing a huge economic fallout, and our unemployment levels are probably approaching 50% now. So we are weekly, we're chopping up like a ton of vegetables, and there's a guy who has a brewery who's using his brewing vats to make soup. But there's just tons of initiatives like this that are reaching out to the poor. So why are we in the States? Well, South Africa, a little bit of history for you guys that don't know about South Africa. We were colonized originally by the Dutch in the 1600s. We were a trading post between Europe and the spice route in India, where the ships could come by and get refreshments. And there was really fertile soil. And then this Dutch settlement came here, and they started, building a city. And I went to a school where there were predominantly English people. So I faced a lot of hostility, because even amongst the white people, there's this hostility because of a war that happened over 100 years ago between the British and the Afrikaners. And so I faced a lot of bullying and ridicule, and high school was an incredibly difficult time. And it really made me very angry. And I just faced all this hostility every day at high school, and it just this anger started boiling up inside my heart, and I just started literally becoming crippled by it, and realizing how destructive this power of anger and unforgiveness is, as it has a hold over me. And then I started feeling this real tension in my heart as someone who calls himself a Christian, but holding on to this anger and unforgiveness and hatred, and daily having to face my aggressors and my perpetrators in this bullying high school environment. And it only happened through a lot of prayer and, spending time with God that I was able to find freedom and really start forgiving these bullies at school. But then I reflected on my country as a whole, and I realized that this experience that I was having is reflective of what's happening at a national level in our country, with this hatred between, the black people and the white people, and even between the white people, between the British and the Afrikaners, and between the tribes. So all these dynamics are at play. There's tribal hatred, there's racial hatred. My white minority government was controlling, only 10% of the population was controlling 90% in apartheid, where they were forcing 90% of the people to have no rights, no ability to vote, no freedom, and giving them sort of chunks of land that were very second rate. And the only way black people were allowed to come into white cities was if they had a work permit. Literally, they were not even free to travel into the cities. And so there was a lot of exploitation and a lot of just terrible, government legislated racism that apartheid was. So this obviously caused a lot of the black folk to become extremely angry and resentful and full of hatred towards the white folk. And they tried sort of peaceful resistance like Mahatma Gandhi, and that didn't work. So then they started resorting to some militant resistance against the apartheid government. And there was a wing of the ANC called Umkhonto weSizwe, who were a militant group that were using, military strategies of placing bombs in locations where there are, a lot of white people, to really cause people to listen to them, because no one was giving them any opportunity to, to have freedom as citizens of South Africa. And so what happened is, one night, our church, which they were told was a predominantly black target, the liberation movement, the Umkhonto Sizwe, the black movement, thought it was a soft white target that they could hit. So during one of the worship services, during in the mid-90s, when we were going through into our first democratic government, some young militant guys attacked our church. And there was actually a group of people of color in our church, but they just started firing with automatic weapons and hand grenades. And literally, the result was that 58 people were injured pretty badly, including a friend of mine, who I'll speak about a little bit later, and 11 people were killed. So it was pretty tragic. So we've got this backdrop and this landscape of just incredible racial hatred, tribal hatred, huge amounts of violence and bloodshed that has spilled over this country. And I was even thinking about even the animals in South Africa have a pretty bad temper, there's probably about 20 different types of animals that want to eat you, from great white sharks to crocodiles to, lions, hyenas, leopards, you name it. So it's a pretty hostile, angry place. But how do we as Christians operate in an environment of hatred and violence and vengeance and bitterness and anger? And when I started traveling the world, I started realizing that our challenges in South Africa are not just isolated to our country. And when I arrived in the Balkans, I felt that I could really relate to the people, because of the fact that there's been all this cycles of hatred and violence and bitterness and anger. There was a scripture in the Bible in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 31 and 32, that speaks about this very thing. And it says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." And I thought, wow, that really sums it up, There's so much bitterness and rage and anger and brawling and slander and all kinds of malice. But the antithesis to that, the opposite of that, is being kind and compassionate and showing forgiveness, because this is what was demonstrated to us in the most profound way by Christ on the cross. And when I had a revelation of that, when I had a picture of Jesus Christ on the cross, suffering and bleeding and rejected and crucified in the most brutal way because of what I have done, because of my sins. And when it became personal, that my sins had placed him there. And there was no way I could undo the wrongs that I've done. And that's why Jesus went to the cross, because of my sins and the sins of the world, And this is why I think the foundation of the Christian faith, it is so critical that we embrace this truth, and it doesn't just resonate in our head, but it really drops to our heart, and we're able to really live it out. And even though I was calling myself a Christian, I was so filled with vengeance and hatred towards these bullies at high school that I was literally enslaved by it. I was literally enslaved. It's like a bondage, like a yoke that just keeps you bound to the perpetrators of whatever evil has been committed against you. And when I saw people like my friend Gillian Schoenbroecker, who was a medical student in this particular attack on my church. And the hand grenade sort of exploded right next to her. And being the unselfish person she was, she thought, I could throw this hand grenade away from me in half a second, but it'll kill someone else. So I will just take the explosion for myself. And she lay there, and someone shielded her with his body, the guy next to her, and he died. And she had her body ripped apart by this hand grenade. And she was in hospital for more than a year. She had about 27 surgeries trying to save her leg, and shrapnel went into her body and all over. And as soon as she was released, she missed a whole year of her medical school. As soon as she was released, she went to the prison of the guy that had thrown the hand grenade, and she sat down with him and she extended Christian forgiveness to him. And I thought, what an example of Christ-like forgiveness. But how is this possible? You know, how can we extend this kind of supernatural forgiveness? Because the reality is, when we are the victim of a terrible crime and a terrible atrocity, we want justice. And there's a very real thing in that. And there's a very justifiable thing in wanting justice. And so we're going to look at what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. But when we try and take justice and vengeance into our own hands and we allow it to fester, it is like a wound that becomes full of pus and just becomes septic and destructive. And we actually have to open this wound and push out that pus so that the wound can heal. And this is what happened in South Africa during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was led by Desmond Tutu, who later won a Nobel Peace Prize. And he recognized the importance of having victims and perpetrators coming together and creating a platform where they are able to confess their wrongs and ask for forgiveness. And Tutu would break down when he heard the horrendous atrocities that had been committed in South Africa in the name of this apartheid, which evidently was actually being supported by one of the Dutch Reformed churches. And so he was just devastated when he heard the level of things that people were confessing. And it was an incredibly healing time in our nation. And when everyone else was predicting that we were going to have a horrendous civil war because of all this hatred that was coming out, our president at that time, Nelson Mandela, chose to walk a road of forgiveness. And with Desmond Tutu and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they were able to exemplify the Christian values of confession and forgiveness. And this, I believe, is what saved our nation from a bloodbath. So this was at the same time in the mid-90s where the Balkans were going into all their wars. And it was also at the same time that there was a massacre happening in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis, where this hatred and vengeance and just raw evil started breaking out. And in the space of 3 months, these two tribal groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, the talls and the shorts, had literally massacred each other with machetes as the world stood by and watched, because there was no economic reason for the United Nations or other foreign countries to get involved in any kind of peacekeeping capacity. So this was the antithesis of what harboring hatred and unforgiveness can look like in a nation. And we were so fortunate that we had a leader that chose to walk the path of Jesus Christ and chose to forgive his perpetrators and to create a platform where victims and perpetrators can sit opposite each other and ask each other for forgiveness and receive forgiveness. So that's just a little bit of history of South Africa. I want to read you a quote by Desmond Tutu, which I really found helpful from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He says that amnesty cannot be viewed as justice if we think of justice only as retributive and punitive in nature. We believe that there is another kind of justice, a restorative justice, which is concerned not so much with punishment as with correcting imbalances, with restoring broken relationships, with healing, with harmony, and with reconciliation. So I think there's two parts to the story. There's the first part, which is actually the forgiveness part, which is what happens in my heart, where an injustice has been committed against me. I am a victim of being bullied. If my bully never says sorry to me, I can still forgive him. I can still let go of that injustice and not take vengeance in my own hands. But for the next step to happen, for reconciliation to happen, there needs to be a coming together of both parties where the bully, the victim, and the perpetrator sit down together, and there's a deep remorse from the perpetrator towards the victim. And if that happens, then reconciliation can happen. So that's the second part. So the first part, the forgiveness part, is about our hearts, and the second part is about relationship to be restored. So one of the things I think that Rom has been very big on is the whole area of gender-based violence. And this is something huge in South Africa, and the number of cases is just escalating, you know. So women are finding more and more violence now that they're locked in their homes with their husbands who are losing work. So for reconciliation to happen, there has to be a change of heart and a deep apology from the perpetrator towards the victim, you know. So what we're going to look at now, which I think is important, is what forgiveness is not, you know. So forgiveness is not denying that this evil was in fact an injustice, that this evil thing, you know, it's not just brushing it under the carpet and pretending it never happened. It's not just glossing over the pain that you suffered and saying that it's okay, you know. It's not removing all the consequences of the evil, because when you read in the Bible, in Paul's letter, he says we shouldn't repay anyone evil for evil in Romans verse 12, but in Romans verse 13, he said God ordains the government to be the agent of vengeance. So that still means that government should have a police system that brings perpetrators of domestic violence to book, and they are punished for it, you know, and rapists don't get away with it, and murderers don't get away with it. So we do need a justice system that addresses these injustices. You know, forgiveness is not approving of evil in any way or condoning abuse or acting as if the sin never happened, and it's not, you know, allowing others to continually abuse you. It's not allowing a woman to stay in a home with a man who's abusing her, you know. So I think it's very important to make those clarifications. What is forgiveness? I've entitled this talk that we're speaking about the freedom of forgiveness, and I spoke about the bondage of unforgiveness that literally keeps us in a prison cell. You know, I felt like I was tied to my bullies, my attackers, by this hatred in my heart. Like it kept me in bondage. So forgiveness is freedom, you know. The Hebrew words literally speak about something being covered over and carried away. It speaks about a release of debt. It speaks about turning a key, opening a cell door, and letting the prisoner walk free. Nelson Mandela spoke about that, you know, the long walk to freedom, how he was able to literally step out of his prison cell of hatred and step into freedom as he forgave the architects of apartheid. Forgiveness is to write across a debt nothing owed. I was reading actually some of the Hebrew words for used in the Old Testament translations for forgiveness, and one of the words is Kapha, Kapha, and this literally means a covering something over. And in the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, where the Ten Commandments were and all of that, that mercy seat was called the Kapha, and that's where the blood of the lamb covered, the ark when they did the sacrifices, the atoning sacrifices for sins. And that's literally what has happened on the cross with Christ. His blood has covered over a multitude of sins, and so that we are set free from this slavery and this bondage of sin and all the wrongs that we've done. Forgiveness is literally taking the trash out, It's literally throwing this trash that's causing a stench in our hearts and taking it out. It's granting a full pardon to a condemned criminal. Again, that doesn't mean that you're not letting the justice system take place, but you are not bringing that vengeance to your attacker. It's literally to smash a clay pot into 1,000 pieces so that it cannot be pieced together again. So these are some of the expressions of forgiveness that I thought are quite helpful. So practically, what does that look like? How can we actually forgive? And the reality of it all is that we can't. On our own strength, we cannot do it. In fact, to live a Christian life is not a difficult thing. It is an impossible thing. We cannot be a Christian, and I realize that when I try in my own strength to be a Christian, I fail again and again and again, dismally. And I think this is what Paul addresses as well in his letter to the Romans. In chapter 7, he speaks about his failures and the things that he wants to do, he doesn't do. And the thing that he does do, he doesn't want to do, and he speaks about the struggle between this old nature in him that is wanting to do the wrong things. And one of those wrong things is to hold anger and unforgiveness in our hearts. We can't get rid of it on our own. And Corrie ten Boom spoke of that when she faced her, when she was in the concentration camps, in the Nazi death camps with her sister, after helping a lot of Jews in Amsterdam in her house. They put her in the concentration camp, and the things she saw and the atrocities she saw were just beyond words. And then when she faced one of her Nazi prison wardens, this hatred came over again, and she could not forgive him. But she asked Christ to help her, and Christ in her allowed her to forgive. And I think this is what the scriptures speak of again and again and again. And the whole of Romans chapter 8, after Paul saying, I don't know why I'm doing the things that I don't want to do. Romans 8 speaks about the only way we can do the right thing is by the Spirit of Christ in us, which is the Spirit of forgiveness. And this is what releases us, And Philippians chapter 2, verse 13 speaks about God working in us to act according to his will. It's a work of God in us. It's not a work of ourselves. Of course, we have to align our choices and our will according to him. We can't be stubborn and just continue doing, the wrong thing. We have to make a choice to surrender ourselves to his Spirit working in us. So we need to ask Christ for help. We need to ask the Holy Spirit that leads us into truth to do the right thing, And then it's also, people think that forgiveness is a once-off. It's not. It's a constant choice that we have to keep on making. And it's not just an emotional thing. All of a sudden you feel like you love your attacker, It's a constant choice to keep on surrendering this hatred over to God, and it's a process. And I think Corrie ten Boom described it quite well. She was like, this pastor took her up into a church bell tower, and he asked her to pull the bell, and the bell was ringing, ding dong, super loud. And the more she pulled it, the louder the bell rang. And then as she let go of the rope, the bell slowly started fading away. And I think that's a good illustration of unforgiveness. Is we need to let go of this hatred and just surrender it to God. And then the bell will, and we need to keep on making that choice to let go. Otherwise, the bell is going to continue to ring very loudly, and that hatred is going to stay fueled in our hearts. So yeah, there was one more quote that I wanted to read by Charles Spurgeon, and he basically said, "My life was full of sorrow and wretchedness, believing that I was lost, but the blessed gospel of the God of grace came to me, and with a sovereign word, deliver him, and I was but a minute before as wretched as a soul could be, could have danced for the very merriment of heart. And as the snow fell on the road away from the little house of prayer, I thought that every snowflake talked to me and told me of the pardon I had found, for I was white as the snow by the grace of God." And then years later, he added this: "To be forgiven is such a sweetness that honey is tasteless in comparison with it. There is one thing sweeter still, and that is to forgive. It is more blessed to give than to receive, and so to forgive rises a stage higher in experience than to be forgiven." And everyone that I've spoken to that has been able to reach out to someone that has hurt them in a terrible way and forgive them has experienced that same thing, even if the person is not recognizing their own wrongs, you know. So the song Amazing Grace, actually, I was reading a little bit into that. John Newton wrote this song, and he was a slave trader, and he was responsible for terrible atrocities on these slave boats. He was one of the worst sailors, foul-mouthed, cruel, terrible man. And there was a shipwreck that almost killed him. And during that shipwreck, he cried out to God for pardon and for forgiveness. And he encountered the forgiveness of God in such a powerful way that he was then moved to become a priest, and he started studying theology, and his life was totally transformed. And he ended up writing this song, Amazing Grace, you know. And the words of that song ring so true, you know. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. And the reality is that we are all wretched, and we all have contributed to the brokenness in this world in a smaller or a larger way. And we all are guilty, you know. We all are guilty, and we've all contributed to pain of some sort to someone else. And so when we move the finger away from pointing to someone else and we move it back to ourselves, that's, I think, when we are able to start showing compassion to others as well. And this is what happened with Jesus, with the woman who was caught in adultery, when they were going to stone this woman to death. And Jesus started writing in the sand, and he said, "Whoever is without sin, you throw the first stone," you know. And so I think when we start recognizing our own brokenness and the way that we have contributed to the brokenness in this world, and stop pointing fingers at everyone around us that is breaking the world, you know. And that applies to our own people as well. We can think that our own people are innocent, you know. And I was having a conversation with an African woman, and she said, "You white people are the problem of, you know, all the problems in Africa are because of you white people." And I said, "I agree, white people have done terrible things in Africa. And I'm so sorry on behalf of white people about what white people have done. But please don't tell me that Africa was heaven on earth before the white people arrived. There was terrible tribal warfare. Shaka Zulu was a mass murderer who slaughtered tens of thousands of people with spears. If he had had the Nazi machine guns, he would have killed a lot more, you know. So our people are not innocent, you know. And so on a my people level, on an individual level, I'm guilty, my people are guilty, but it's very easy to, you know, play the victim and think that I am just totally innocent. And I think when we recognize our own brokenness, that's a good start, you know. So, yeah, that's all I had to say today. If anyone's got any questions.
Yes. Yeah, let's open the floor for questions. Yeah. Camilla, thank you. I can actually ask a question now to start us off. I know in the States, I kind of grew up thinking or understanding. I didn't grow up in the States, but I was American and felt a connection to the States and would visit. And I grew up with the kind of mindset that, like, slavery was over 150 years ago, or, maybe less back when I was a kid, 140, 30, whatever it was. That was a long time ago. Racism is over, blacks and whites have equal rights. Like, that's all taken care of. And if someone says otherwise, and they're just complaining or making a big deal out of it. And it's taken me, 20 years of very small baby steps to come to really understand and accept and believe strongly that slavery may be over, but racism is not over in the States, and to recognize that and to see that there's a lot that still needs to be done. So I'm wondering about what the situation is like in South Africa now. What are some continuing racial problems, race-based problems?
Yeah, thank you, Camilla. Yeah, I think the whole racial thing is really has been flaring up again. There's two things that have happened that I really believe are a blessing from God, actually, in terms of racial unity. And one of them is South Africa winning the Rugby World Cup. Sport has an incredible way of unifying people, and it was an incredible thing for South Africa to win that in black and white. And the team was so representative of all the nations. So there were blacks, whites, mixed race people in the team. It was just a wonderful representation of our nation, and it was just incredible. And it's the third time we've won the Rugby World Cup, and every time I've just felt like literally racial unity improving. But before that, I think there has been quite a lot of just racial hatred. I think because we have so much unemployment, we have a high crime rate, and a lot of people who've been victims of crime, they've started doing racial profiling and saying, all the criminals are these kind of people, and we just want to leave this nation, and all of those people are like that. And then amongst the black people, they're saying we're still in poverty after sort of 25 years of democracy in this nation. We're still in poverty. The white people still have all the money. We need to take back what is rightfully ours and just chase these white people out of this nation that belongs to us, So and the politicians have been fueling those fires as well, without actually accepting their own responsibility and saying, actually, we've had 25 years, and the amount of corruption and stealing at government level has also contributed. So the government has also contributed to the poverty of the people, but it's much easier to blame than to accept responsibility. So that's what, apartheid will forever be blamed for the problems in South Africa. And it's easier for the politicians to just go there and say, it's the white people that have destroyed this nation, and we are just innocent. We're trying our best. But actually, that's not the case. They are incredibly corrupt as well. So, but then the other thing I think that also unites a nation is a common enemy. And COVID-19 is a common enemy. Initially, when it hit South Africa, it hit the white population first because it came from Europe, people who'd been traveling in Europe, some white travelers. And then there was this dialogue on the street that this is a white man's disease and black people are fine. But now it's obviously devastating, black communities as well. So it's this common enemy that has brought unity, like we're all standing against COVID-19. And it's actually amazing to see how compliant many people are being and wearing their masks. And like, we're such a non-law abiding society, but actually there's been incredible compliance and people wearing masks and washing their hands and all these feeding initiatives from affluent white populations going into the slums and feeding the poor. So there's a lot of things I think that God is doing through this COVID-19 that are bringing national unity. So I'm very thankful for that. And yeah.
Interesting that there is someone who is thankful for this coronavirus, crisis.
Well, there's a beautiful verse in Romans 8:28 that says, all things work together for good, for those that love God and are called according to his purpose. And you can see it, plus the ocean, nature is just celebrating. There's more dolphins than we've ever seen, and whales, and just so many species of animals we've never seen, and lions on golf courses, and it's amazing.
I would just like to affirm you for what you have shared today. I find it very powerful and very much needed. And if I can just say a few thoughts on what you are saying, what you have been saying, what I find very much concerning today is, I've been now, Bojan is the one who leads Rome, and he's going to do amazing things in the future with it. But I'm reflecting on the last 20 years. At some point, some of us almost thought that we have nothing to say anymore about reconciliation and some of those issues, that this is all behind us. And yet it seems to me that nothing of this is behind us, that the divisions, not only in the Balkans, but across the globe, have become intensified more than ever before. So I would say that Rome has even more work to do in the days ahead of us. And especially this thing about blame shifting, mutually across all kinds of divides, whether they're ethnic, racial, ideological, of religious nature, or that in nature, groups are blaming the others for everything. Balkan is a good example. We have had a history of this, and at Rome we used to talk a lot about this. How can you get a genuine reconciliation when in this group, take former Yugoslavia, I don't know how many groups, think about Second World War. When you think about today, when basically each group thinks that we have no problem, it's the others. It's the others. And it's them who needs to ask for forgiveness. It's them who need to do something about it, not us, because we are only victims. And this kind of syndrome of victimhood, we are all victim of the other one, actually is like a brake onto, like in the car, setting a brake on the car doesn't allow it to move forward because everyone is braking. Everyone is braking. And then forgiveness and reconciliation becomes very fake and artificial. Even when it is made at some levels, at the levels of governments, there is a lack of sincerity about this because you realize they're not really meaning it, because the next day they will make a statement that opposes any attempt to reconciliation. I'm just kind of, ranting a little bit around along those lines. I think this is kind of a challenge for the future. How do we go about this? Because whatever you have said is 150% right. But I think the challenges have not gone. They become even worse. And I'm not going to be a pessimist, but I don't expect that anytime soon things are going to get better. And this is not only in the Balkans. When we're observing what's happening around the world, I would say the whole world is a Balkan. The whole world. From the Balkans across the United States of America, and then to all the other parts. The same story happening everywhere. Different groups blaming other groups. And if we could only get rid of them, then we will be happy. And of course, this does not lead to peace and reconciliation, but only to some new potential conflicts. Okay, that's just a little addition.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tihomir. It's so true. I went to this very remote part of the world on this island in the middle of nowhere in Vanuatu with these tribal groups that were literally unaffected by the world, and they call them the happiest people on earth because they're just full of smiles and they sing and they dance and they wear their little tribal grass skirts and they're very, very festive people. But the amount of hatred that I found there was phenomenal. There was one tribe that was accusing another tribe of, stealing their chickens sort of 7 years ago, and they had held that grudge for years and years and years. And you just see it there, it's like, and if we're not going to fight about someone stealing our chickens, we'll fight about whatever, football teams or, so there's always, it's a reflection of the human heart. You know, we have darkness in our hearts, and we need to confront our own darkness.
Anyone else have a question? I have another one. I was thinking about situations where, even in, say, circles of people that I know, where there's a conflict and it's not clear who's the perpetrator and who's the victim. Both sides think of themselves as the victim. So what could be the first step towards helping those two people reconcile, either from someone from the outside, or what steps could one of them take?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I think this selfish, sinful component to who we are always wants to see ourselves as the victim. You know, we never responsible. We always the victim. And you look at it like a 2-year-old. You know, like, who broke this? And like 2 little toddlers will point their finger at the other one, and that's just the nature of our sinful man. So I think. I think it's, you know, we need, first of all, like, encounter Christ, because I think the Holy Spirit is the only one that reveals our sinfulness, you know. Otherwise, we think we're pretty righteous. And it reminds me of the Pharisees, where Jesus was in most conflict with the religious leaders and the Pharisees, who would say, God, I thank you that I'm not a sinner like that person. I'm so morally superior to them, you know. And it was the sinner who was beating his breast that was who was the one that Christ recognized. And we actually, you know, I can't convince someone of their sin, you know. So I think it's a work of God, and it's a work of the Holy Spirit, and that's what forgiveness is. You know, it's I can't cause someone to forgive another person, but what I can do is journey with someone through the Gospels and show how Jesus does, you know, and Paul as well speaks about the reality of the brokenness of our hearts, and the darkness in our hearts, and the sin in our hearts. And that's something that I think we need to, you know, really journey with God to discover. So.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, please.
Because Rachel, what I was thinking of too is that you're right, Beau, you know, you journey with someone on that forgiveness level, but in a case like this, sometimes I found it's really good to be able to like mediate and be able to have these two people be in the same room together and respectfully talk to each other and have a dialogue, and let them both go ahead and see where they've been wronged. Let both of them see where they're at fault. And hopefully what happens is you see people who are generally trying to forgive, right? Make a choice to hear the other side and see that, yeah, maybe I did do something wrong, and I'm sorry, that type of thing. But that mediation seems to be helpful in a situation like that.
Which requires a lot of humility, I think, as well, to recognize, you know, that I haven't got it all together, and I actually have also done things that have harmed another person, you know, because it's easy just to be the one that keeps on slinging mud without recognizing the mud on yourself, you know.
Christine would like to ask something.
Sorry, hi everyone. I've been kind of listening. I just remember this last weekend, I think it was a sermon, and just talking about that same thing about that Martha talked about, that mediation. And one thing that our pastor said that kind of struck me, that was kind of an insightful thing about that mediation process, was that mediator needs to be a neutral person. That mediator can't agree with one person or the other, otherwise it's not successful. So just something to think about. So
yeah,
because I've been in cases where we've tried mediation, and I feel like it failed. And maybe one of the reasons was because the mediator was not neutral. So
then it's a 2 for 1.
Nice. Anyone else?
I just have a comment and a kind of question connected to it.
Sure.
I was listening to a talk earlier from Dr. Caroline Leaf. She's a neuroscientist. Basically, she studies brain, but she's also Christian. And she said that forgiveness changes brain cells, you know. And she pointed to a study about that. So I'm just wondering, because she's actually from South Africa, are you familiar with her and her work?
I am familiar with her. I haven't read extensively. I've read bits and pieces because a few other people have told me about her. But I'm aware of the neurological and physiological benefits of forgiveness. I mean, harboring bitterness and hatred and unforgiveness literally can cause a multitude of sicknesses and cancer and all kinds of things. So I think a huge contributor to health is forgiveness, you know, for sure. So it's interesting that's been part of her study as well.
The name.
Oh.
Caroline Leaf.
Can someone put the name? Can you put that name?
Yeah.
She's asking.
Yes.
It's already there. Thank you.
Oh, it came now.
Okay.
Caroline Leaf.
Yeah.
She has talks on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So you can find her on YouTube, and how to detox your brain. There are 4 series. It's really good.
Okay.
Very cool. Yeah, I'll look at that. That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking that if you go ahead and put the focus of Ram with reconciliation and forgiveness, we will never not have Ram, because that is human nature. Things will not get better. So we as believers can go ahead and spread the gospel and, you know, and share that what will make the difference for real peace and reconciliation and forgiveness. But until that happens, we're going to have Ram for a long time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And Beau, I liked your emphasis on, I think it's very important. And I think at former Romans, we also used to emphasize this, because otherwise you can never move with forgiveness unless this is present. And this is restorative justice versus retributional justice. Because if we are going to wait for everyone to just repent and confess and admit, we can wait forever.
Yeah.
But there is this restorative justice that kind of doesn't seem to be same thing, but I think it's the justice of Jesus Christ, and that's the one when he on the cross was shouting, saying, "Forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." So by this he forgave the world, although most of the world was not even aware of that moment, not even today, of the value of forgiveness and that it has anything to do with them. He already released his forgiveness. And that is a forgiveness, the hardest kind of forgiveness, where you're extending a hand to an undeserving side, to put it like this, in hope that this forgiveness will lead eventually also to, let me use the spiritual term, repentance. It might never happen, but in hope it will lead to that. So it is released even before the other person has come to a point of realizing, yes, I've done something wrong. It's the hardest form. And I'm saying this being very humbly aware that I'm far from good at this. But that's the way to go. So thank you.